So yeah, thank you. Any of that you're happy to share in the chat, that would be really great. So who am I? As Nikesh said, I'm a Churchill Fellow from 2017, and I'm a leadership and wellbeing coach. How I got to doing that was I've been a social impact consultant and trainer for the last 4 or 5 years. Yes, I've been working in the social impact space for all of my career, work mainly with small impact-driven organizations, really noticed a sort of need among leaders in that space to have people to bounce ideas around with. And so that's what sort of led me to coaching. I didn't actively set out to be a wellbeing coach, but what I found is that in those one-to-one spaces with people, well-being comes up so strongly in those conversations that I felt it was important to equip myself to have conversations about well-being. I'm also location independent, which means that I move around quite a bit. So I've had to think about well-being and self-care for myself and what it means when I'm moving to new places regularly. And if I'm completely honest, when I think about my fellowship, I didn't really think about self-care back then. I think it's a lot more on my radar now than it was back then. But it's been really interesting reflecting back and thinking what opportunities were there to think about self-care, and hopefully I can share some really useful insights with you guys on that. So here's our plan for the day. My aim is for all of you to have created a personalised self-care plan, which is going to help you stay well through your fellowship. If you don't finish it, then you'll at least have made a good start and something that you can continue developing after this session. And the format of the session, as Nikesh shared, it's being recorded. So I'm not going to invite you to share personal things in the room or anything like that. What I'll do is I'll share a little bit of content. You'll have some individual reflection time on each of these topics. And then later in the session, we're going to have some breakouts so that you can share thoughts and ideas with each other. And we will have some plenary discussion and time for Q&A at the end. And I want to invite you to participate throughout the whole session using the chat. So I will ask questions, share your thoughts in the chat, and I'll read those out, but I won't attribute them by name so that we can maintain your confidentiality for whoever's watching this in the future. And I also, I just want to say that I'm not going to share anything revolutionary today. I'm not going to introduce any sophisticated new self-care techniques. This is really focused on what do you already know about yourselves and what works for you and what you need to stay well, and how can we pull all of that great insight together into a plan which is going to help you to get the best out of your fellowship. So I'll stop there for a moment, have a little look at who's in the room. Oh, great. I didn't mention, for my travels, I went to the USA and Colombia. So had different experiences in each of those places, obviously. And I can see we've got people going all the way to New Zealand, Australia, Germany, Jamaica. Great. Love that. Thank you for sharing. And for anyone who has joined, just introducing myself, I'm Natalie. I was a fellow back in 2017, and I'm also a leadership and wellbeing coach working with people in the wellbeing spaces. So before we dive in to the content, I would love to get a sense of where you are with self-care and well-being for your fellowships. So I'm going to ask you to give yourselves a rating in the chat. If I ask you, how confident are you feeling about maintaining good well-being as a fellow? What comes up for you? Share a number from 1 to 10 in the chat.
Yeah, got them.
I'm not sure if everybody's on mute. You could just check, that would be helpful. Okay, So yeah, if you can give yourselves a rating, 1 to 10, how confident are you feeling about maintaining good well-being as a fellow? Okay, good. I'm seeing 6s, 7s, 8s come through. So there's a lot to be positive about here. I'm seeing. So next question is, what are some of the things that give you confidence? What are some of the things that you think, I know I'll stay well during the fellowship because? You can share that in the chat as well. Excellent. Good support at home. You'll be keeping in touch via WhatsApp. Being realistic and not creating self-pressure around it. Already seeing some good techniques being mentioned. So box breathing and meditation. It sounds like you've got your own self-care practices that you know you can use on the fellowship. Keeping in touch with people back home. That's great. Yoga and running, sense that you're good at self-care anyway. So I'm seeing lots of good stuff here about things you're already doing. You know you can take those with you on your fellowship. So that's really nice. Okay, so next question. What are some of the fears or concerns that you have? What's getting in the way of making that 7 a 10? What might get in your way of staying well during your fellowship? Okay, yeah. Will I get the contacts? What if no one gets back to me? I can definitely relate to that one from planning my fellowship. I had a lot of stress around that, probably, and anxiety. Will people want to meet me? Will my schedule be too busy? Too much time alone? Yeah, is my fellowship going to be meaningful and unique enough? How is my schedule realistic? Yeah, it's a lot to do on top of your work and the other things you have in your busy lives. Okay, thank you for sharing those there, and I can see commonalities and some of those fears and concerns that you have. So you're definitely not alone in worrying about those things, and I can relate to many of them from my experiences as a fellow as well. So we're going to stick with these fears and concerns for a bit and look at what might some risks be to your well-being whilst you're traveling. And this is not about creating a long worry list or getting caught up in what might go wrong. What we want to do is recognize the challenges that might come up. Because if we've thought about them ahead of time, we're going to be much better equipped to handle them and address them when they do come. So this is an opportunity to say, what are those challenges? And to think and to come up with a plan for how can we mitigate those risks and what do we want to do about them when we see them coming up. So here are a few of the things that I thought of when I thought about my fellowship, and when I thought if I was going on a fellowship again, what might be some of the things that could come up and get in the way of my well-being. And you've already mentioned a lot of these. So there's overworking and lack of balance. So especially if you are doing this alongside work, and I would imagine that you have some fairly demanding jobs. You've got personal lives as well. So there's a lot going on, and this might feel like an extra thing. And you might find yourself overdoing it, or the balance shifting too far one way. There might be something for you around stress or perfectionism. I know when I did my fellowship, I felt that I really wanted to do a great job. I wanted to do a great job for myself, but I was also aware that my employer has given me time off. They're kind of counting on me to deliver something of value. The trust has invested in me. So I want to do something that's really good, really worthwhile. But I think it's helpful to remember that all those people who have expectations of your fellowship also want you to stay well. They want you to do a great fellowship without sacrificing your well-being. So those are a few things to look out for. And some of you might be working on topics that are sensitive or that are familiar to you. You might be doing work in areas where you have lived experience, and the conversations you're having or the thinking you're doing around those topics could be emotional triggers for you. They might trigger thoughts that are unhelpful or feelings that are going to have an effect on your well-being. And whilst you're away from home and maybe in a completely new place and a new culture, you might suffer from culture shock, or you might feel homesick. So that might be something that comes up for you. And all of this might result in exhaustion. You've already talked about, is my schedule going to be manageable? So you could end up feeling exhausted. You might feel lonely, and that could be in the sense of, I'm on my own in this new country. But it could also be the fellowship is a very individual endeavor, so feeling alone in the pressure and what you're doing on your fellowship. So those are a few of the things that might come up. And I know you've already shared yours as well. One more thing that I just wanted to add for us to think about is burnout. And it's a word that we hear a lot. It is a recognized condition, and I wanted to share the symptoms with you, mainly to invite you to notice them, to think about if this happens at any point during your fellowship, then do reach out for help. So if you're feeling any of these ways, look out for those. If your well-being is suffering, these are some of the ways that you might notice, right? So these are the signs that you can look out for to know, is there something I need to be doing differently to help me stay well? So if you're feeling tired, if you're noticing your mood isn't quite as good as you'd like it to be, perhaps you're irritable with other people, something not quite right with your physical health, that might be a sign. If you're lacking motivation or feeling emotional, or if you're falling into bad habits. So I'm sure some of these are familiar to you, and you'll have noticed these at other points in your life when your well-being isn't good. So we all have signs, we're all different. And as I said, what we're going to try and do in the workshop today is really identify, what do we know about ourselves that can help us set ourselves up for success and help us to manage our well-being and put good self-care practices into place for our fellowships. I'm just going to pause for a minute and check the chat. Okay, so yeah, just seeing a few more points that came in around some of your fears about staying well on your fellowship. So yes, maybe cramming in too much and costs. One of the tips that I remember finding so helpful when I planned my fellowship, and I know that the team are really big on encouraging this, is to think about your schedule and not cram too much in. Like, having that space in your schedule can be really helpful. So we're going to get started now, each of you thinking about what are the risks that you might notice in relation to your well-being, and what are some of the signs that might tell you, I would like to do something different here to make sure I'm taking better care of myself. And I think it's also worth acknowledging that there's going to be different things that come up at different points on your fellowship. So you've got the period before you travel. And I remember for me that was probably my busiest period. I left my planning quite late, so I was really busy sending out loads of emails, trying to arrange lots of meetings, lots of late nights and early mornings doing that coordination and trying to get my meetings in. So there was one set of things I had that would have been useful to think about before I travelled. There's the time when you're away and you might be staying in one place or you might be moving around. So different things that you might want to think about during those travels. And then there's the time after your fellowship. So when you come back, it doesn't end there, of course. You're going to create your report. So there might be different things for you to think about, different stages of your fellowship. So Nikesh and Ellie are going to drop into the chat a worksheet that I've put together. This is where you're going to create your self-care plan. And the first part of this plan is thinking about what might some of those risks be for you, or what might some of your needs be when you're thinking about your fellowship. What might come up for you that is something you want to watch out for in terms of maintaining good well-being? And what do you want to think about before your fellowship, during your fellowship, and after your fellowship? And then we're going to get to the more fun part of the session, which is about what we're going to do about that. What are some of the positive practices that we want to put in place to address it? So hopefully you can all access that Word document in the chat. And I'm going to give you 5 minutes to sit and think for yourself and work through part 1 of that guide. And then we'll come back together. If you can't access it for any reason, you can either post a message in the chat or raise your hand and we'll see if we can get it to you some other way. And I'll set my timer. So yeah, take 5 minutes to complete part 1 of that worksheet. Rob, I see your comment about not seeing the worksheet. I'm wondering if someone on the fellowship team could send that to you by email. Nikesh and Ellie, is that something you can do?
Yeah, we'll get it to you, Rob.
Thanks, Ellie.
I always do this. I click off it and then I can't get back onto it. I'm not sure why.
see I've got a question in the chat of can you send me the completed form later, which is an interesting question. So the forms are mainly for you, mainly for your benefit, to see what feels right for you. But I'd be happy to have a conversation afterwards if that's something that would be useful. And I'll share my contact details if you want to get in touch. So nobody's going to review these and see how good a job you've done of filling them out. They're really for your benefit. Okay, that's our timer up. How are you doing for time? Did you manage to get through that part? Give me a thumbs up if you're getting through it, or would you like a couple more minutes? I'm seeing thumbs up and people looking at the screen, so I'm going to move on. But obviously you've got these to come back to if you want to put some more thought into that part of it. Yeah, I'm curious what came up for you doing that reflection. Is there anything new that you want to share in the chat as something that came up thinking about what those risks might be for you? Gareth, I see you've raised your hand and you're welcome to share. I'm just going to, oh, you've gone. Okay. Just to remind everyone, we're being recorded. So I want to be mindful not to invite you to share anything that might feel confidential, in case we don't know which other fellows will watch the recording in the future. So just that's why I'm inviting you to use the chat. But I am also happy for you to speak into the room if you're comfortable with that.
Yeah, Natalie, all I was going to say is the big thing for me is I know how my sleep pattern's affected. And so particularly when I'm feeling a little bit anxious about things. So for me at the moment, it's all around the planning and making sure that I've got enough contacts and everybody's happy to see me and all that kind of stuff. So I think that's the biggest indicator for me. I think for me as well, I think it's probably age related as much as anything else in terms of my sleep pattern. As I get older, I find that I struggle with that more. And giving myself time for relaxation. And I think when we go on our travels, yes, we're clearly the opportunity to enjoy the local environment as well. And so I think that.
Oh, I lost you a bit towards the end there, Gareth, but I heard some great self-awareness around your sleep patterns and what you need in terms of sleep and thinking about that when you're traveling. And you were just mentioning opportunities to appreciate the local environment where you are, which is kind of, it could be both, right? It could feel like, oh, there's so much to do here, end up being really busy, but it can also be a great aspect of your self-care. You know, how can I really appreciate this environment that I'm in? How might it contribute to my self-care? Thank you for sharing, Gareth. So, as I said, we're starting with this to give us a really good foundation for thinking about what do we want to do about it? What do we need to be mindful of? What can we have in place to make sure that we're minimizing some of these risks and that we're proactively addressing them before we get there? So let's talk about what we can do about these things. I'm going to put my slides back up. I see there's some great comments coming through in the chat as well, and we'll come back to those. So some pointers for self-care, and just going back to what I said at the beginning, this is not revolutionary stuff here. This is not about learning lots of new skills or adding things to your to-do list. This is about what do we already know is good for us and how can we apply it in the context of our fellowship. So these first ones are going to be very familiar. We all know these are good for us, right? We want to have good sleep. We want to keep moving, eating healthily. These are the foundations of staying well. Easier said than done sometimes, especially when we're busy and we've got a lot going on. But we know these things are good for us. I've also noticed some of you sharing in the chat your own self-care practices. So things that you obviously do regularly that you know work for you. So breathing. I've got mindfulness and journaling are really popular self-care practices. There's good science base that tells us that these things really make a difference to our day-to-day well-being. And support network, and I noticed a few comments around how supportive others were being already, or having not given that much thought yet. So your support network is a really, really valuable aspect of your self-care. And I mentioned earlier that the fellowship can feel like a really individual endeavour, but I think it's helpful to remind ourselves that we're not really alone. You know, there's lots of people who care about your well-being and who want you to flourish in your fellowship. So we'll have a little think about support networks in a moment. And then, as well as having good self-care practices, these are things you can do for yourself every day, wherever you are. There's some other things we might want to think about in relation to doing the fellowship. So a few that I thought of were around working hours. So if you're doing this on top of your full-time job, are you working the same hours? Do you want to have a conversation about doing anything different with your working hours? How can you fit this in without doing the overworking? When you're traveling, how much work is going to be expected of you, and what can you plan in advance to manage that? You will want to think about your accommodation. So you want somewhere that you're going to have good sleep, somewhere that feels safe and quiet. You might want to think about, does it have facilities for keeping my work going or for exercising? So really thinking about, what do you need to maintain good self-care, and what environment is going to help you do that, so you can plan this before your trip. A lot of you mentioned keeping in touch with people back home as being something that would support you on your fellowship. So having a plan for that, you might want to think about, you might know that you're going to have Wi-Fi everywhere. That's great. You might want to look into, what if I wanted a local SIM card? What would be the best way to make sure that I'm contactable, if in case family want to get in touch with you, or to help you keep in touch with them. And because you're traveling, your daily routine might change. The working hours in the country you're going to might be different to at home. So you might want to think about, what does my self-care routine look like in this different setting? And some really good tips for self-care that I want to share. The first one is around keeping it simple. So this is not about, as I said, it's not about coming up with a sophisticated plan and adding lots of things to your to-do list. It's really about, keep it simple, but do try and schedule it in. focus on little and often. So you don't have to run 10 miles a day. There's evidence that even moving for 5 minutes a day is really beneficial for our mental well-being. So if you do have a packed schedule, it doesn't mean you can't do this. And I've shared some links in the worksheet to some great articles about really quick things we can do to keep ourselves well. And if you've had a bad day, it's really easy to have a day where we don't do all our self-care practices, and we know we should, and we start beating ourselves up. If you've had a bad day, just remember that tomorrow is a new day, and you can start fresh, and you can reset your intentions with your self-care that day. Marcia, I see your hand is raised.
Hi, yeah, sorry. I'm disabled and I use a mobility scooter to get round, and I took the last 6 weeks off just to get ready for my fellowship, and I've met with 3 people that are fellows, this year's fellows, which has been really helpful. But when I started trying to get to check that my mobility scooter was okay to go on a plane, particularly with Singapore Airline, they would not give me an answer. They would just say, book your ticket, book your ticket. Also, because of some of my medication, which is controlled drugs, I then reached out to the Singaporean authorities, and they say, no, we need this. We need the ingredients, everything. And for the last 3 weeks, I've been like this. And finally, my friend said to me on Friday, Marcia, if they're doing this to you before you're traveling, imagine what they're going to be like. Yeah, they may be great airline and that. So I thought, okay. So I went and reached out to Emirates, and straight away, they were really great and everything. So I'm hoping to go with them. But it was 3 weeks of, what? I've not even left the house yet. So that's why I couldn't fill the form in, that you were saying, because it's like so much. But the host that I'm going to be spending time with is already thinking about my self-care in that. And it's like, wow. So it's like 2 sides of things. And it's, yeah. So the accessible has become inaccessible for me. And Pete, who's one of the people on here, we spoke a few weeks ago in that. And things were still going like, yeah, I'm going for it. But the last few weeks have been really tough because of that. So sorry, I just couldn't articulate it in, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Marcia. Yeah, it sounds like I can understand that's been tough. I'm really glad to hear that you asked for what you've needed in that, and you've found, it sounds like you found a solution, which makes sense. And that is one of the things that isn't on my list and should be around asking for help and not feeling alone in this. So yeah, thank you for sharing, Marcia. So in terms of self-care, I shared some examples, but I know there are loads more. And I'm sure there are people on this call who are more expert than me in a lot of what those practices are. And you are all certainly more expert than me in what your best self-care practices are. So let's, yeah, what self-care practices do you have? What would you add to my list that you can share in the chat that might prompt a good idea for somebody else before we do this part of the worksheet? Be kind to yourself. Yeah, that feels like the kindest thing we can do for ourselves, doesn't it? Sometimes it's hard to do the other self-care practices, but we can always do that. We can always be kind to ourselves. What else? What other self-care practices work for you? Yeah, being really mindful about what we eat and what we're drinking, reaching out for support. Yeah, there's a reassurance in hearing that people have these are shared challenges. Yeah, it's absolutely not just you facing these. getting outside, having a cup of tea. I love these. Yeah. It's a great reminder that this doesn't have to be a big thing that we plan. It's those little things we can do for ourselves every day. Make sure you pack your tea bags if having a cup of tea is one of yours. Great. So, and in terms of asking for help, I've seen that's come up a few times, and it's not always easy to ask for help. Some of us are not very good at it. I will put my hands up and say, I don't always ask for help when I should. But most of us like helping other people. So if you're someone who struggles to ask for help, I want to remind you that people really like helping. So maybe you're giving someone the opportunity to do something good for you. And there is a link to a resource in the worksheet on how to ask for help if you think that might be useful for you. It gets easier the more we practice. And so maybe this fellowship is an opportunity for you to think about, how could I practice asking for help? Because you can't do your fellowship all on your own. I know I had to, it was quite new for me to reach out to so many new people and ask things of them. So it is a really good opportunity to practice doing that. Okay, I'm going to give you another 5 minutes now, quiet reflection time, to work through the second half of the self-care worksheet. Which is thinking about those risks and those worries that came up for you in the first part. What self-care practices do you know work for you that you would like to put in place for your fellowship? So yeah, I'll give you 5 minutes quiet time to work through that, and then we'll come back together. Ellie, would you be able to pop the worksheet back in the chat again for anyone who got cut off and rejoined?
Yeah, of course, no problem.
Thank you. Okay. Our little timer has gone off. Hopefully that gave you some good time to think about your self-care and what you would like to have in place for your fellowship. While you were doing that, I've been going through all of your messages, and I've added a slide to the slide deck with all of your great tips for self-care. So I'll make sure that's included in the version of the slides that get shared afterwards. We've got, so I'm going to put you in breakout rooms now and give you a chance to talk some of this through and to share with others here your self-care plan. And there's an invitation to share whatever you're comfortable with sharing with others in the room. You don't have to go into all the detail of it or share anything that feels sensitive to you, but a good opportunity to say aloud some of what you would like to do, what you would like to have in place, and to hear from others and maybe get some inspiration for yours. So you'll be in rooms of 2 or 3, and you'll have let's say 8 minutes, so a couple of minutes each to share, and then a couple of minutes at the end to reflect, and then we'll come back and we'll have a little time for questions at the end as well. I can feel that some good conversations were had there. That's beautiful to see. And we just had a suggestion before you land back around being in touch with other fellows, and particularly other fellows who might be in the same place or time zone. So checking whether that's going to be the case on Mobilize might be a good option before your travels. I actually met up with another fellow on my travels, and it was fantastic. We had a great evening, but also it was so nice to talk to someone else who was going through the same thing as me, and just to have that sense of solidarity in it. So you are all part of each other's support network in that respect. Okay, I can't believe how quickly an hour goes. We've got 5 minutes left. Would love to see in the chat any sort of anything that came up for you in that conversation, great ideas that you heard that you think others here should know about. Would love to hear any reflections in the chat. And I said I would keep time for questions, so if you have a question, really happy for you to speak it in the room. If you want to raise your hand, if you prefer to ask anonymously, feel free to send me a private message, and I'm happy to respond to that. Yeah, what questions do you have? What's still on your mind about this? It's good to hear how other fellows are doing things. Yeah. Sometimes that sparks an idea or helps reassure us we're on the right track, doesn't it? Marsha, do you have a question?
Yeah, just an observation. I really want to sort of fast forward to the day before I fly, but then it means that it will all be done too soon. But I'm just sort of like, I want to do it.
Yeah, what a great observation. And I saw at the start of our chat some comments around like that feeling of pressure before you go, of will everything be organized? Will I manage to get in touch with all the people I want to meet? And I remember that. And I guess what my reflection looking back on that is, it's okay if you don't, if you don't manage to organize everything in advance, or you don't get through to all the people you want to meet with, you will still have a really good and productive trip. So yeah, it's easy to get hung up on those things, isn't it? But yeah, a little bit of perspective on the bigger picture of what it's going to be might be helpful there. Okay. seeing some requests in the chat, so a link a link to the itinerary template would alleviate some of my worries. If anyone is able to pop that in the chat before you go, that would be really helpful. Yeah, exciting and daunting, those two sides of the same coin. I guess that's helpful to remember that, you know, where there are worries, there's also things to be excited about as well. Any more questions before we wrap up? Not seeing any questions, which is good. Okay. So one final question that I have for you before I let you go, which is, if you only do one thing, if you only take away one thing from this session that you will do for your self-care on your fellowship, what will that one thing be? What can you commit to yourself that you will do to take care of yourself through the fellowship? You can share that in the chat. And while you're doing that, I'm going to put a screen up with a QR code on. I would love your feedback on the workshop today. Anything you liked or anything you would love to see done differently if there was a future session. I will find that really helpful for improving what I do, and I appreciate that. And I'll pop in the chat a link that you can do that on if you don't want to use the QR code, and really happy for anyone to connect with me via LinkedIn if you want to continue the conversation. And I believe all of these resources will be available for you in the Fellows resources area on the fellowship website, and they'll be shared in Mobilize as well in the next few days. So that's where you'll find them. And thank you all. Thank you for contributing. You've made this workshop by sharing all of your tips and all of your thoughts, and I really appreciate that. And we'll make sure that you get a version of the slide deck that includes all of your great wisdom. And yeah, wishing you amazing fellowships. I can't wait to see how they go and start seeing some of your reports coming through. So good luck. Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care, everyone.